Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and if you've been on the channel long enough, you will know that I am kind of a one-trick pony. The one spec that I've been playing since the beginning of, the channel has been the Outlaw Rogue. I've been playing it back in Mr. Pandaria in PvP when it was not that great, and tried to continue playing it throughout WoD, and then when transformed into Outlaw in Legion, I stuck to it, whether through good and the bad times. It's just been a favorite playstyle of mine for quite a bit of time. I try to stick with Outlaw the whole rating tier of this expansion, and Azshara down, Gahun down, Jaina as well as N'Zoth all in cutting edge, all as Outlaw. I try to do Mythic Pluses whenever I can, mostly as Outlaw, and even PvP. Even though Outlaw isn't fantastic for it, I try to PvP as Outlaw as much as I can. And in this video I want to kind of talk about the viability of Outlaw going to Shadowlands for PvP. Just primarily taking a look at where the spec stands and what some of the different utilities it has gotten with the expansion of Shadowlands. How is it looking if you want to PvP as Outlaw in the next expansion? So first things first, let's take a look at the toolkit that Outlaw Rogue is getting as a rogue rather than just what the Outlaw Rogue part brings, because there's quite a lot that rogues are getting in general as a class. All the rogues are going to have evasion. For Outlaw, this is quite new, but evasion is a reliable defensive that works for ranged physical attacks as well as melee physical attacks, which is a bit of an upgrade from the parry repos that Outlaw had in BFA. Kidney Shot also makes a return as a dedicated CC, so no longer will you have to spend 5 common points for a 5-second stun using Between the Eyes. Between the Eyes instead becomes a debuff we maintain, and while we do lose the ability to get a ranged stun, this is at least going to bring us more in line with the other specs, having a dedicated stun without any weirdness about it. The poisons have returned, and that means Wound Poison, Numbing Poison, and Crippling Poison. Where Outlaw might actually uniquely be able to run Numbing Poison, since Pistol Shot still has a slow, Wound Poison is going to give us a little bit more to that PvP viability. Having some sort of a Mortal Strike effect baked into the Outlaw spec is something that we didn't have back in BFA. So we go from having no healing reduction to actually having healing reduction with Wound Poison. This is going to give us a little bit extra pressure when it comes to dealing with healers, like every other rogue. And standardizing the toolkit on that front does allow Outlaw a little bit more viability, shortening the gap between what used to be the Assassination and Outlaw Rogue PvP meta, where Outlaw Rogue wasn't in the meta at all. I think the return of Slice and Dice is going to be not a bad one. I know it's a buff that some people said, oh, you just maintain it for 5 common points and that's all. Having Slice and Dice come back is not only nostalgic, but it does allow rogues, all specs, to have a little bit more sustained with their auto attacks, where Outlaw a good portion of our damage comes from autos, and also gives us energy regen, which is one of those extra things that every single spec gets, with Subtlety getting common points and energy, with Assassination getting more applications. Slice and Dice is a welcome return either way. One of the things that Outlaw Rogue specifically gets is, first of all, going to be Between the Eyes, which will be a debuff, kind of like a Colossus Smash on an enemy, that'll make it where your critical strikes do more damage to that one target. It is going to be a bit of a haymaker. Enemies are going to know that you're setting up some damage if a Between the Eyes debuff is showing up on them. So you'll probably go for a 5 common point Between the Eyes into Mark for Death Kidney Shot to lock the enemy down and throw everything but the kitchen sink at them. Because if any of those abilities crit, with a crit legendary, which seems really busted, it's going to be quite valuable damage and will potentially give Outlaw Rogue quite a bit of single target burst. Also, Outlaw Rogue might finally become a cleave spec in this expansion, with Blade Flurry becoming potentially one of the abilities we will use for single target burst. It costs very low energy, it actually has physical damage on top of it, and the cleave is much bigger. I don't think we're going to become Armor's Warriors with Sweep and Strikes anytime soon, but being able to cleave multiple targets, especially inside of a melee cleave, might actually be quite valuable, because the damage of it is much higher. So we potentially could be a cleave spec that goes in maybe with another melee and cleaves enemies down. Kinda wish they have given Gouge to the other rogue specs, as sharing is caring, but it's still an effective ability, and I've been using it all of expansion of BFA. It seems very, very powerful, and of course it's going to continue being useful in the next expansion, especially against casters. If you remember Destra Warlocks from BFA, if you were to miss your kick, you still had a Gouge in order to kind of stop their interrupts, and you could follow up into a stun or whatever you wanted. So again, a very useful utility. Grapple Hook as a mobility is interesting for Outlaw though. It is a little bit of a giveaway inside of a PvP situation. where sub-rogues and assassin rogues can just shadow step immediately behind the enemy. Outlaw rogue do have to throw out that grapple hook, then pull themselves in. We do now have a talent that makes grapple hook movement much faster, so it might be easier for us to grapple into a kick, or grapple into a kidney shot, or grapple into a gouge, or whatever it may be. So that is going to be nicer. But we are the one spec that still can't just yeet ourselves away from the enemy. Just pick a direction and go, whereas sub-rogues and assassination rogues can only shadow step to a target. So if everybody is in close proximity, you don't really have a way for you to get out of that situation with a bunch of slows on you. So Outlaw rogues potentially could just run away from enemies' cooldowns, which could maybe give them a little bit of advantage in certain matchups. I know how many people hated Roll the Bones, and with this ability you'll just press it and you'll get random buffs. And just make sure to maintain some sort of a buff. It doesn't really matter what buff it is, because Slice and Dice will be doing majority of the damage for you anyway. Finally, the talent of Dreadblades is making a comeback, and this was pretty strong back in Legion. This combined together with something like a deeper stratagem allows Outlaw rogues quite a bit of burst damage and a lot of control. So with Dreadblades you'll activate it, and for 1.5 minutes you generate a load of combo points. Pushed together with an adrenaline rush, you'll be able to use both of those abilities together to swing a Sinister Strike into a full kidney shot, Sinister Strike again into a between the eyes to set up a debuff on the enemy, pistol shot into a bunch of dispatches if you want to. This gives Outlaw rogues a bit more of an organized burst ability. It is just going to be a bunch of combo points, but those combo points can translate into a viable burst. And Dreadblade's on a fairly short 1.5 minute cooldown if it has any success like it had back in Legion. This is going to be a very valuable ability to bring into PvP. So now comes a couple of questions of how will Outlaw rogue play when it comes to trying out the spec in the next expansion. And essentially we'll play just like Assassination rogues do right now. We'll probably be using our kidney shots to line up stuns on the singular target, whoever will be our focus, and trying to use CC with blind, gouge, as well as cheap shots, maybe from a vanish, maybe sometimes kidney shots, in order to CC secondary target, like in 2s or 3-3s. This is going to make our playstyle much easier, because currently right now, Outlaw rogue simply doesn't bring enough damage, but it has a ton of CC. Gouge, a ranged stun, a shorter blind, vanish stab that you can follow up after stuns and blinds, shorter stun CD because as we get our common points spent into finishers, between the eyes comes back a little bit faster as a cooldown ability. So we lose a lot of this control, but hopefully we'll gain more damage. And I think that's really where it's going to come down to Outlaw rogue's viability, is if the damage is going to be enough. Because if the rogue doesn't do any damage, what was the point of bringing them? All this CC can be useful, and rogues have been okay with CC, but I'm really hoping this expansion Blizzard controls the amount of damage we do, allows us to do some decent damage without having to cross our fingers and hope for Gushing Wind procs while we CC the enemy into the next expansion. So far in the beta, Outlaw rogue feels great to play, because finally you have some damage. Being able to maintain your Slice and Dice, you Roll the Bones, and that whole playstyle with Blade Flurry Cleave, it does give you this brawler feel to the spec. Very similar to what a warrior might feel. So it's almost like you're a warrior with the dagger in the offhand and the sword in the main hand, which is, I think, what most Outlaw rogues will end up wanting to gear for, gear-wise, because daggers, more poison applications. I think it's going to be really cool to see where Outlaw rogue is going to go, because it always had this kind of wild card play style to it, where it was just a weird and different spec of rogues, where the subtlety rogue and assassination, you already knew what to expect from it, and Outlaw you had no idea what to expect besides very low damage. So hopefully with these changes, we'll finally see Outlaw rogues doing a little bit better and become more competitive within PvP. Because since all three rogues will play very similarly, besides subtlety and constant cheap shots and kidney shots, and assassination having Garrote as the one thing that really helps them out with multi-bleeds, Outlaw rogue will play very similar to the other specs. We'll usually be using kidney shots to line up CC onto our kill target with a blind onto a cross CC. So because of this, I'm actually very excited. Because of this, we might finally get to a point in expansion, hopefully, where you get to choose as a rogue which playstyle you want to play. It doesn't matter whether you play one spec, the other, or the third, because all of them play more or less very similarly. And yes, that means losing a little bit of that uniqueness, but Outlaw will still keep a couple unique things that could give that edge. First of all, Roll the Bones. We all hate the RNG of it, I get it. I am someone who doesn't hate the RNG of Roll the Bones, and I'm perfectly okay playing it. But Yes, you shouldn't play the spec if you hate some parts of it, but I've never minded the Roll the Bones RNG. But I do understand, like, sometimes you'll just get a really bad luck of the draw, and it just doesn't feel great. But Roll the Bones is going to be a little different in this expansion. For PvP, it's just a buff for you to maintain, alongside of a Slice and Dice, which I kind of love. Between the Eyes has an opportunity for us to create some great single target pressure that plays off of our crits, which is something that we are really strong about. That's one thing that Outlaw had, is the crit buff and the crit capability, and certain abilities have a higher chance to crit. We're kind of going to be like Elemental Shamans and how those play with crit, so maybe we might be a unique spec where crit will actually be good for us in PvP, whereas for other specs it might not be as good because crit has a 50% reduced value. And then there is the Blind talent, where Blind becomes a 1.5 minute CD, so 30 whole seconds shaved off of that ability, and it has a far greater range, so you can blind enemies from further away. Which in PvP, that's kind of what helped me even do moderately okay as Outlaw. Get an opener, throw a blind at the healer. They're thinking, oh, blind, which is a 2-minute cooldown. I better blow my trinket, which is also a 2-minute cooldown. It seems like an even trade, but then later you'll have the blind and they won't have the trinket back up. So if you can exhaust enough CC out of enemies for them to pop cooldowns to survive a little bit, the little pressure that you do bring into current BFA version of the game, like, it still is going to give you that advantage that this spec will have compared to the other specs of Rogue. This is something Assassination and Subtlety will not bring. It's still a very powerful toolkit, but it's also very unique to your playstyle. Playing Outlaw Rogue on the beta so far, I mean, this isn't a finalized version of the game, and the numbers are not final by any measure, but goddamn does it feel so good to pick up your Outlaw Rogue and just play the game. Just properly play your class, get your Slice and Dice up and running, get your kicks and kidney shots down, line up big between the eyes, and use the artifact weapon that came back to the Talons, the Dread Blades, in order to line up some great bursts. Combine some legendaries into a variety of different setups and use the damage that the spec finally feels like it has in order to play the game like a normal person, instead of just throwing billion CC, everything but the kitchen sink at the enemy, and then hoping for a gush and proc here and there. So take a look at Outlaw as we have played so far. As long as Blizzard doesn't go and massively, drastically nerf us within PvP, I think we're actually looking like a decent and maybe even a solid spec to get into PvP in a far better viability than the current version of Outlaw Rogue in BFA has been. So that's pretty much going to be it for me. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about the possibility of Outlaw Rogue in PvP? And would it be a spec you even might give a go in Shadowlands? Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. And I'll see all of you in another video.